Could I just request, yes. Could I just request you, to bring this down to earth?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Martin, for a very interesting presentation. Obviously, you've taken up a very difficult task, which is looking out 25 years. And certainly, what you said is a possible outcome. I will say it's even a plausible outcome. But of course, the world looking out is always difficult to predict, especially you're taking a 25-year view. So in that context, let me say there are a few things I'm not too, let's say, enthusiastic about some of your comments. One is this idea of rising uncertainty. Now, everybody likes getting up on stage and saying the world is going to be an uncertain place. But the fact of the matter is, if I had asked you in 2020, you would have said, oh my God, we are in the middle of a pandemic, the world is an uncertain place. If you had asked you 10 years earlier, in 2010, you said, we've just come out of the financial crisis. This is an uncertain place. Go back another 10 years, we've just had the dot-com bubble burst, Asian crisis, the world is an uncertain place. Go back another 10 years before that, oh my God, the Soviet Union has collapsed. So the point I'm making is, the world is an uncertain place. We should just accept that and get on with it. It's not becoming any more or less uncertain. We'll find out if it was a bad place or a good place after 25 years. The second point is worsening policy making. Well, certainly not in India, I hope. But while I agree that policy making in the West in the last decade or so has been some sort of suspect, I hope at some point, and I'm assuming at some point, people will stop listening to Stiglitz and Krugman. I mean, people do respond to situations as they emerge. And while, politics in the West right now looks all jammed up, it's a bit too pessimistic, I think, to think that, societies will not respond to those situations. So the point I'm making is, yes, I mean, it is a plausible outcome that you outlined, but I don't think it's any more plausible than a much more optimistic one. It is a possible outcome. But I will say there are a few things that would happen if that path was taken, which I think do need some consideration. One of them is, do remember that India's population growth rate is radically slowing. To the effect that effectively our population is growing at less than 0.5%. In the 2030s, it will basically not be growing. So, which means that our per capita income from here on is almost identical to our GDP growth rate. In that sense, we will see our per capita income growth dramatically go up just by virtue of the fact that our population is not growing. In fact, somewhere in the end of the period we are discussing, we will in fact be slipping into negative territory of circa 2050-55. So we do need to take that into account. So, and hence the point about our urgency of trying to make the next 25 years count. Now, in that context, something else will happen in the rest of the world. I think we will enter into an era of radically cheap capital. Because in an environment, given the demographics of the world, you will end up, and I'll give the example of China, which is now will be the world's largest economy very shortly, where its savings rate will simply be sticky because it is aging rapidly. It will not fall very fast. But its investment rate increasingly will find that there is not enough, that huge investment boom that happened for building infrastructure, housing, etc. It doesn't need shrinking population. So what you will have is its collapsing investment rate and a sticky savings rate. And some version of this will happen in other developed countries as well. China will be the most dramatic. Which will mean that all of them will end up in an environment of huge surplus savings, which the rest of the world will have to absorb. And that will mean that India has an opportunity of getting massive amounts of cheap capital sloshing around the world which we could use to grow a lot faster than anybody anticipates. So yes, perhaps a more difficult place to export to, but a source of very, very cheap capital. Now this brings us up to a particular problem that we don't give enough attention to when we are talking about the middle income trap, which is the capability of financial systems in countries in India's stage of development to be able to sensibly allocate this huge surge of capital. In fact, this is what happened to most countries that get stuck in the middle income trap. Let's take, for example, the Southeast Asian countries. They grew very, very quickly, a lot of it using cheap capital from the rest of the world, and misallocated it. And then they had the Asian crisis in 1997-98 and never quite recovered from it. And this is, I think, of the many things that we need to think about. This is something that we don't pay adequate attention to. We will get the capital to build our bridges, build our homes, build those factories, do many other things. In fact, India's fiscal will dramatically improve if our domestic interest rates decline, which I expect they will in the medium term. But what will happen is that we will always have to watch our financial system very, very carefully, that it doesn't do something nasty. And as a person who spent 2017, 18, 19 cleaning up banks, let me tell you, I never want to go through that experience again. It's like extracting teeth. So this is, I think, the single biggest risk to us. And in fact, there's already discussions about our equity markets being a bit frothy. So this is something we need to watch out for. As far as FTAs are concerned and trade openness is concerned, I would say that today's policymakers are generally sympathetic to the idea of being open and export-oriented. We certainly want to be a part of the global supply chains. We do want to sign FTAs. We have signed one with Australia, one with UAE, and hopefully the new government in the UK will be able to sign one soon with Britain as well. So this is something we do want to pursue aggressively. But at the same time, I will say, we will, like any country, protect our interests. And in this context, let me say that we have found that blocks like, for example, Europe, have begun to use things like the environmental, social, and governance norms as non-tariff barriers, and in ways that are not entirely kosher. I mean, it doesn't really smell well when green steel is defined in a peculiar way, in which all the patents are held by those same countries. So this requires a degree of give and take, and we will protect our interests. It's not because we don't want a part of the global supply chains, but I think there is a case for having a reasonable, balanced discussion about what things like ESG mean. I'm not arguing against environmental, social, and governance norms. I'm just pointing out to you that these norms have to be arrived at with discussions with countries like India, which want to trade with. They cannot be unilaterally imposed through CBAM or whatever other mechanism. So I think the point I'm making is that we want to be open. I have certainly no interest in going back to Nehruvian import substitution and drive around in ambassador cars. So totally with the idea of keeping ourselves open, exporting, and being a part of the global supply chain. It is going to be important. And as I mentioned, a lot of our building of our economy will happen with, of course, domestically driven capital, but the extra kick is certainly going to come from foreign capital. And the ability of our economy to be able to take both this vast and growing pool of domestic capital and cheap global capital and allocate it sensibly without blowing it up over 25 years, a difficult task, but something we will have to do. With that, let me stop. I hope I've been adequately provocative.
Yeah, okay. We're absolutely on time. Thanks. I was given a slot by Pradeep as a moderator, but I do think that there ought to be an opportunity for discussion in the panel itself. I don't know how hard a stop we have at 7:30, or is the room needed elsewhere? Oh, well, I wasn't expecting quite that much indulgence. So I'll try and make it a little thematic. Okay, let's because I think for people to know when it's going to end rather than drift away is better. So a number of issues have come up, and we have a lot of expertise in the room. And I've given up my, what time there was allocated for discussion within the panel, moderated by me to accommodate Sanjeev. Now, let me call on people if they don't mind. So the first issue, or one issue that has arisen in what Sanjeev had to say, in what Martin had to say, what has been Pradeep's life's work, is really what are the challenges for India in its economic diplomacy. Pradeep, let me ask you, and then I'll maybe go to Raja Mohan. I don't know if there are any people in the room who have been our diplomats in Geneva or whatever, but how do you see, as it were, becoming a big boy in economic diplomacy? Do we have the skills? Are we, Raja Mohan had said in terms of the way we reacted to the collapse of the Soviet Union, crossing the Rubicon, that, actually when the challenge arose, we were up to it. Do you see our capacity as having increased? I see Ambassador Masubito Mukherjee is here too. Maybe she'd like to come in. Let me get you to start.
Well, let me begin with point out that we have former ambassador to the WTO, Ujjwal Bhatia here.
Oh,
and he has also been the chairman of the appellate body, which is now defunct. That is one of the biggest challenges that we have today in front of the multilateral trading system, is to how to revive the dispute settlement system. Now, in terms of India's economic diplomacy, I think we have been very aggressive in a way, very negative. That has been a problem. I had a very good discussion with Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who wrote a book which was released recently, and he said that India is less of a naysayer. I beg your pardon, I said, look, India continues to remain a naysayer for no rhyme or reason. I'll give you two examples. I have served on the WTO DG's advisory panel thrice, and this is the third time. And can you imagine that India moved a resolution in the General Council objecting to the DG's power to appoint a such panel? I said, don't you have anything better to do? You're doing an example of the ludicrous.
What could be more important than clipping Pradeep Mehta's way?
No, not my way, no. Actually, they were hitting the DG. But what I'm only trying to say is this, did the ambassador or did our mission not have anything better to do there? Secondly, what was something which is politically very unsmart for part of India was to object to the adoption of a plurilateral agreement, which we have not discussed at all, on investment facilitation. So basically ease of doing business. Now, what had happened was, this is an agreement which about 126 countries out of 160 countries or have agreed upon, a plurilateral agreement. Now, when we are talking about FTAs, don't forget that even plurilaterals are non-multilateral. And why plurilaterals took place, so I'll come back to that later. But we objected. We objected to that at Abu Dhabi in the MC30. And can you imagine that a number of developing countries, the least developed countries, who found it very awful, and they confided in me personally that, look, we found it very awful. Now, this impacts on our aspirations to become a leader of global south. And nobody in the Commerce Ministry understands these, you cannot connect
Okay,
these
well,
dots.
so then the takeaway, and this is a public
No, just give
session.
me an example.
No, what I'm saying is this is a public session, but you are basically saying that we're not at the cutting edge of where
No,
we
yeah,
need to
and
be.
in the sense that the Commerce Ministry does not know, this kind of situation, and what you are doing is something which you're cutting your nose,
Let me-
bite your face.
Raja, you write both on, as it were,
No, so therefore, let me conclude that on economic diplomacy, I think, the problem is, and I would like Pujib Bhatia to speak about it. He's been one of our very sober ambassadors to the WTO as against many others that I have seen. I'm not going to name them. Don't laugh. So anyway, the point is that, we are well known for being negative unnecessarily. And that reflects someone on the point is that we're not interested in the open.
No, so the issue that this raises, coming back to Montague and coming back to Martin, is the issue the bureaucracy or is the issue the leadership? Or is it, as Montague was arguing, is it the protectionism of our private sector? So what gets in the way? No, I don't want you to answer. I'm just waiting. Ambassador Bhatia, where are you? Yeah.
Might be.
Both should India write off the WTO as a forum? What should it be more proactive? And what would we gain if Pradeep is right in being always cited as a naysayer?
Well, I'd like to respond to what Martin said about India's place in the emerging order. And I think we should not really be focused on whether we'll be an advanced country or a higher middle income country. The point he made was that we will be a very important country on the world stage. And I think our economic diplomacy has to reflect that aspiration. And how do we do that? And I think in some of the points that Pradeep mentioned, we are a great supporter of multilateralism. But today the world, the WTO is in such a place where there is not much consensus being developed on multilateral issues. And therefore the question is, should we be opposing plurilateral initiatives when multilateral issues are not on the table as of now? So, and the other point he mentioned again, I would agree with that. If we have this aspiration of being the leader of the global south, then we need to voice issues of the global south in such a way as to build consensus in the WTO, rather than just saying no. So I think there is some scope for us to reflect on what our economic diplomacy should be in the context of our aspirations for the future.
Thank you so much. Raja, may I now turn to you?
As you know, I'm an interloper into this, but it doesn't you invited me. Basically, three things. One, I would say, without internal modernization, your ability to deal with a changing world, especially when the rules are being redrawn, will get harder and harder. So therefore, without internal modernization, we're not going to do much of an economic diplomacy. Second, when negotiators go abroad and say, give me more time, I need time and space, I got poverty, I got all kinds of other excuses that we made. You win time and space, the diplomats win that time and space, but that time is not used for changing the way you organize things internally. Third thing I would say is really... The third thing I would say is, you are in a place, much of the trade rules, the economic rules are being rewritten. The WTO, when Trump comes back, is even going to be even more dead than it is today. It doesn't work for the United States, therefore they're going to change the rules. Here I think we got to get used to plurilateral arrangements. We got to create like-minded coalitions. This means breaking away from the traditional premises of multilateralism and working only in multilateral solutions.
Okay. Sanjeev, do you have a thought? You've talked a lot. Do you have a thought on how to create state capacity in this specific area? Have you thought about that at all? Is that what I understood Raja to be talking about?
I mean, it's a long topic, but let me say, I think it is true that we need to be thinking of issues in a completely new and fresh way, where Indian negotiators go to an issue in a fresh way, looking at how things actually are. And I'll give you one example to illustrate the point. For example, one of the things we always negotiate for in the rest of the world is for work visas in other countries. Now, in my view at least, it's a complete waste of time. And I'll tell you why. You know, what are these work visas justified on? Oh, we need H-1B visas because our IT companies need to go there. Hello, you want to work from home. This is the one industry that should be able to work from home. Why do you need to move to America to do this? You should be able to do it from wherever you are. You need a B1 visa to go there occasionally at best. So the point is, this is a 1990s idea of what IT industry needs. And yet, this is one of the important things that our negotiators, negotiate for. So I'm just giving an example of outdated things we have in our list.
Can I reframe the question?
Yeah.
So, is this because of lack of awareness, or is this reflecting, as it were, the influence of lobbies, or what?
No, I think slow movement of how things are, and I think here there is an issue of institutional memory in our system. So what happens is that you see a learning system would learn after a while that it is pointless negotiating H-1B visas. But what happens just by the time the negotiators learn this, he is transferred to becoming Joint Secretary Fisheries, and somebody else comes here. And that person has been reading in the newspapers that H-1B visas is a wonderful thing to have, so again starts negotiating this. I'm exaggerating, but this is basically how it works. And I think this is something in which, for example, in this specific area, we've been trying to create, for example, IIFT as a repository of institutional knowledge. I don't know if it's working, but certainly there is a realization that this is an issue and we are trying to fix it.
And also, I think that we are not organized for the way the world is done today. So if you think about electric vehicles, the batteries are done by the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers, the cars are done by the Ministry of Heavy Industry, electronics are done by the Ministry of Electronics. By the time we are already 15 years behind China, their fiscal powers and fiscal interventions are 10x what we can afford. And all these ministries will keep pushing files to each other, and so we're just not organized efficiently. You think about energy prices, energy costs. And you have a Ministry of Power, a Ministry of Coal, Ministry of New Renewable Energy, Ministry of Oil and Gas. Why? There should be one Ministry of Energy. So I think the government's organization itself is, I think, grossly inefficient, and I think it needs to be restructured quite dramatically if we need to compete efficiently and respond to what Raja was saying, that whatever time is bought for us to move faster, we need to have the government move more efficiently.
So, Martin, if I could just come to you, I mean, I'm in a sense trying to apply to Monte, the other thing we could be talking about, to get a sense about what the forces are pro and anti-openness. But since we've got on to state capacity, let me just ask, are you impressed by the ability of the British state to modernize? And this is a serious question. And where does the push come from? Does the push come from the cabinet secretary? Does it come from politicians? Any reflections from an advanced economy?
Well, I'm glad there's a simple question, so the answer to that is no. The more interesting question is whether there are any that are good at it. And now, I'm not an expert on state capacity, but I would guess among the developed world, it will be a few of the small countries, Finland, Sweden, obviously Singapore, and and those are going to be the models. There's a crucial aspect to that which I think is very important, and it's something you have to think about, which is the advantage of being very small, and particularly very small and open. So we wouldn't have a debate in Singapore whether trade was important. That debate wouldn't last more than a second. So the question they would, so I have a part of my recent book which discusses, well, why is Singapore able to do what it does? And the major answer to that, of course there's prior conditions, is it's a matter of life and death. And so you design your administrative system to do what is most important, which is sustain yourself as a credible platform for global commerce. And if you're a very large country, or even a moderately large country, that's a second or third order consideration. And there are all the other considerations, and they dominate the way administration works. So it is very, very difficult for a very, very large country to focus itself in a way that makes this work efficiently and quickly. China is something of an exception, but I don't have time to go into the way that works in my perspective.
Okay, so this was not central to what Martin had to say, but Sanjeev has put on the table the notion that efficient capital allocation is a very important element in certainly in productivity and possibly in competitiveness.
Sustaining 25 years.
Okay, fine. Nita, I would just like you, as somebody who is in the financial sector, what works well in Indian capital allocation and what doesn't work so well? And have we actually, and there are many people in the financial industry, have we actually, did the IBC and all that represent a cusp change in the allocation, at least of credit?
Oh, absolutely. So that's a simple answer. I think post-IBC, we are seeing companies treat debt very differently than they were earlier. So when you see marquee old houses losing control of their assets because they defaulted on debt, I think the seriousness with which you take debt has increased significantly. It is going in the other direction right now, meaning companies are actually deleveraging. But that's primarily because I think the operating cash flows are growing way faster than the need to invest. So what you've seen is operating cash flows for the top 100 companies have gone from about 4.3 trillion rupees, 2.3 lakh crores in FY19 to about 12 lakh crores, 12 trillion rupees in FY24. And we estimate, these are forecasts, we are stock analysts, we get wrong often, but this can rise significantly in the next 5 years. It is only, I think, FY27 onwards that we see debt going up. But I think what we have managed to do is create efficient plumbing channels, so cost of equity capital is coming down. What we should expect, because partly what Sanjeev said, that our fertility rate is falling, infant, the low age dependency ratio are coming off, savings should be going up, and they are going up. The aggregate number does not seem that hot because fiscal savings are going up because people are buying house, but savings are going up. And what we need to do better is allocate. Like today, if you do the equity risk premium, for non-financial types, basically if you save in a riskier asset class, which is equity, stock markets, you should be expecting a higher rate of return. Now, that is called the equity risk premium. The equity risk premium in India, compared to when you measure it against the risk-free rate, which is the government bond yield, is actually negative. So today, Indian equities are way more expensive than Indian sovereign bonds. Now, the reason why that happens is because the plumbing channels are totally distorted. So there are the SIP and EFO, which is good. I mean, a lot of these funds are now coming into the equity markets, incessant flow of capital, which has reduced the volatility in stock markets. By reducing volatility in stock markets, the asset class has become even more attractive, and so more money is coming in. When I started talking about the unintended flows of capital, it was $25 billion a year. Now, annually, we are getting $45 billion a year. And so equity capital is very cheap. Now, but that's resulting in Hyundai doing an IPO, taking $3.5 billion out. Whirlpool selling stake here and repaying the debt globally. It is not really going into productive assets yet. And I think what we need to do is find ways of channeling some of these savings into the bond market, get cost of capital down substantially. What the government is doing, and I think our bond markets are very inefficient. And despite the substantial reduction in fiscal deficits, we have not been able to see a commensurate reduction in bond yields. And I think we need to be very focused on improving the health of the bond market. We've been talking about it for 20 years, but that doesn't mean it's not a problem.
Okay, yeah. Ambassador Mukherjee.
Fine.
Thank you very much. I wanted to make first one comment to Dr. Martin Wolf, that in his presentation I was intrigued to see that there was no reference on the impact of unilateral sanctions imposed by the West in the context of Russia and Ukraine on the global economy. That is something that I would love to have some response. As far as FTAs are concerned, I wanted to say that one of the problems that India used to face on FTAs with the EU was because the EU brought in BTIA, that is investment plus free trade, which it was much easier to just negotiate a free trade agreement rather than bring in investment, which they did. The other issue was that when you have negotiations, it doesn't matter whether the person is transferred to fisheries or not. That is for Mr. Sanyal. The point is that when you are negotiating between basically two unequal partners, one partner who is a developed economy and another that was just about emerging, then you are asked to make very deep concessions while the partner concerned is not necessarily non-protectionist. And that is one of the difficulties that we had, for instance, with the India-EU BTIA, because it was the United Kingdom before Brexit that put up the most protectionist conditions, because they had a service economy with strengths similar to the Indian economy, which is precisely why it is now very ironical in case we have an FTA with United Kingdom under a new Labour government rather than the long-awaited FTA with the European Union. These were just comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, this is a very quick one. Obviously, the 30-minute discussion of the entire global economy and its current status leaves out quite a lot. I can give you a very long list. But this was subsumed in my comments about the various threats to stability, among which were included war. I can't remember whether I actually mentioned the word Ukraine, but that's obviously within... that was further within that category. International relations more broadly. It's one of the risks in the current world, and it's not. And it remains a risk. When I presented this at the NCAR, a variant of this, not quite as good. I argued that if India were successful in continuing to grow like this for another 15 years, say, it is not a zero possibility, probably substantially greater than zero, that the attitude of the United States toward it would start looking a bit like the attitude of the United States towards China.
Okay, well, you've provided us a platform. Sanjeev has reminded us that the core issue facing India, which you helped put in a global context, is can we sustain and accelerate growth for 25 years. And that includes issues of productivity, issues of competitiveness, not just those of trade. So my reading of India's journey over the last 30 years is actually we've done not badly on productivity, but nonetheless we've not done well on structural change, particularly as represented by the share of both, well, certainly population, to some extent value added in agriculture, and the share of manufacturing. Neelkanth, how worried do you get about that? What should we worry about? Because the way I see it, we have the challenge of trying to remain globally competitive while having to endure or to accommodate the green transition. So the question I guess I have is, where do you see us as competitive, and are we trying to be competitive in areas where we don't have much hope?
No, see, I think the problem, or at least the opportunity size in the context of the global economy itself is a lot smaller than you think. See, labor-intensive manufacturing is perhaps very productive, very useful for economies which are much smaller. And if you have an economy the size of China starting to do that, then you see the impact and retaliation and protectionism and all of that coming up. Inequality, in fact, global inequality or the rise in inequality globally is something that also is a concern. So, from the Indian perspective, I think the reason why I'm still optimistic is, and why productivity growth has been so strong, is also that on the services side, I think we continue to get best practices from the world, and I think in the next 20 years, business services exports will do to productivity growth and dollar flows and job creation and urbanization what IT services did in the last 30 years. And so we hold great strengths there, and a lot of it is demographics, but it's also about how we've dealt with the education system, how we've expanded capacity. On the manufacturing side, unfortunately, I don't see that being very conducive to labor-intensive growth, given what's happening to robotics, what's happening with how factories are managed. I think the use of AI, even on the services side, I think AI is an opportunity, but on the manufacturing side, actually may be a threat. So I think that as we plan the next 20 years, we have to stop looking at the solutions used by the Asian tigers and for China, because that opportunity itself is not perhaps as big as it used to be.
Okay, so we can go to the audience, particularly. I was interested.
I think the diagnosis that Martin Wood has provided is.
Can you please identify yourself?
Yeah, my name is Gurcharan Das.
Just raise the mic.
This, I think the mic is defective.